Cooper is known worldwide for his research on citizen participation and ethics in government. Throughout his career, he has promoted the study and practice of ethical leadership and is the author of numerous studies on administrative ethics, including his book, The Responsible Administrator, now in its 6th edition. Terry served on the school's faculty for over 40 years and also held several administrative roles. He was a principal investigator in the USC Neighborhood Participation Project and provided leadership to the Civic Engagement Initiative at USC. Recognized for his contributions to ethical behavior in public service, he was elected as a Fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration in 2010, and earlier this year received the American Society of Public Administration's Integrity Award. Terry Cooper, inspiring ethical leadership in government and public administration.
That's great. And we are fortunate today to have Terry's wife, Megan, here. And last night your daughter was here as well, but she's not here today, right? Okay, we just want to make sure. Okay, that's great. Panel, would you please join me? So we have Dr. Weijie Wang, an assistant professor in the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri. He earned his PhD in policy planning and development. Oh, there's a commonality on this one too. In 2015, his research focuses on collaborative governance and strategic human resource management in the public sector. His research has been published in Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, Public Management Review, Administration and Society, among others. Received the 2014 Stats Emerging Scholar Award from NASPA. Janna Rezaee is an assistant professor at USC Price in public policy. Her scholarship and teaching focuses on political institutions and the policy process, with an emphasis on executive and legislative branch policies. She's got a special interest in the challenge of keeping national, state, and regional policies sensitive to local conditions. Her current work includes studies of the intra-executive branch politics of rulemaking, political oversight by congressional committees, and revolving door. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. Cynthia Wilkes is a PhD student in public policy and management. She earned her undergraduate degree in political science from Stanford, and prior to coming to USC, she worked for a behavior design firm based out of Stanford's Persuasive Technology Lab, and that focused on leveraging insights from neuroscience and behavioral psychology to inform product design strategies for clients in a whole range of industries. At USC, she's a diversity, access, and inclusion scholar at the Price Center for Social Innovations. So please join me in welcoming the panel, and look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. It's my great honor to be here to celebrate the retirement of 4 of our distinguished faculty members. As a recent PhD graduate, I benefit directly from all 4 of them. So I think you set great examples to doctoral students like me and others. So my heartfelt thanks to all of you. And also, it's great to be here, to be back to beautiful Southern California. It's a nice getaway from the cold and snow in Missouri at this point. So of course, I'm here to discuss the intellectual contribution of Professor Cooper, my advisor at Price School, is specifically by discussing this book. First, I want to admit that I have only read this book 3 times over the past 13 years. 13 years ago, when I read it for the first time, I actually read its Chinese edition. And as I said last night, there's a nice picture of Professor Cooper on this part, and that's a major reason why I applied to the doctorate program at the Price School. This book also was translated to languages like Korean and other languages. So that really speaks to the international influence and reputation that this book and Professor Cooper enjoys. This book was introduced to China as one of the classics in American public administration scholarship. It's widely used about 2 decades ago, and still widely used in Chinese universities. Of course, the second time I read this book is probably the summer of 2010 or 2011 when I took the class with Professor Cooper on public ethics. Then it sat on my bookshelf for a few years and moved with me to Rochester, New York, and then to Columbia, Missouri. And only recently I picked up again. So every time I read this book, it's like a new book to me, but it offers new perspectives and inspirations. So this book is a classic that has stood the test of time and 6 editions. So what makes this book so successful? Of course, there are multiple reasons. I'm sure that people have different opinions. But in my view, a key challenge in writing a book on administrative ethics is to make it relevant, engaging, and also practical, right? So I think Professor Cooper did remarkably well in all regards. I want to start with the claim that this is an engaging book. You don't say that very often with a ethics book, right? So when you think of an ethics book, it tends to be long, dry, full of long quotes from some philosophers who lived hundreds of years ago, and a lot of jargons, right? As PhDs, we are trained to use jargons, and it's a really slippery path once you start to do that. But I can guarantee you that that is not the case in this book. Yes. Of course, there is a healthy dose of moral reasoning there, but that's for setting the necessary foundation for the practical discussions, right? So after some relatively thick discussion of ethical principles, it is always followed by some really nicely crafted cases. And these cases typically describe some ethical dilemmas, right? And these dilemmas always cause me to pause, sometimes hold my breath, and ask myself, what should you do if you were in that tough situation? I struggled, sometimes mightily, but I got so much relief after reading the insightful analysis from the book. And the cases are typically very practical from real-world daily practices of public managers. So it's really easy for these public managers to relate to these cases. This book is also highly relevant to the practices of the public managers. The fast pace of daily work means that they simply don't have the time to reason morally about the consequences, obligations, or the ultimate ends. They need a practical guide to help them navigate through this tough process of making a decision, making an ethical decision. And typically, it's citizens' trust and interest that are on the line here. So what this book did is it provides a really structured way for these public managers, especially the ethical decision-making model. It provides a structured way for the public managers to make sense of these chaotic situations and to divert their attention to the most relevant part in decision-making and navigate through this process to reach an ethical decision. What strikes me most in my most recent reading of this book is how relevant it is to what is happening now. Right? So at a time when we see forceful separation of children from parents at the southern border, when we see numerous reports of ethical violations at the very top of federal government on a daily basis, sometimes it makes public managers, ordinary public managers, or an ordinary person like me confused about what is right, what is wrong. Some seemingly clear ethical principles become blurred or even questioned. So Professor Cooper, in this book, raised some really hard questions probably decades ago in some earlier editions of this book. But we are still debating about these questions, still struggling to find an answer. It looks as if he had predicted what would happen decades later. So just to give you a few examples of the hard questions that he raised in the book. So I quote here, "What to do if a public employee's religious views come into conflict with duties assigned at work? what is the individual moral responsibility of public employees when facing with unethical or illegal orders from supervisors? How to protect whistleblowers? How should a public administrator choose when the demands of their organizations are in conflict with the obligations to their fellow citizens? Seeing these ethical violations on a daily basis on national TV is frustrating, to say the least. But knowing that a scholar has been working on these questions for decades, and knowing that there is actually a right choice in these tough situations gives you comfort and also confidence. This book, of course, also made significant contributions to public administration scholarship. As the title indicates, responsibility is a key component of the ethics for the administrative role. His discussion on the conflicts between subjective and objective responsibilities and the conflicts between multiple roles of public administrators provides a profound analysis of the root of the ethical problems. I particularly like the idea of citizen administrator, that for a public administrator, you are not only the employee of the citizenry, but also a member of the citizenry. So your prime obligation is to the citizenry, not to your organizations. His major contribution, however, is the design approach to ethics. Max Weber believed that bureaucracy, while being rational and efficient, is like an iron cage that imprisons humanity. So it exerts powerful control over men and women who work in these organizations. The hierarchical control in these bureaucratic organizations is often used as an excuse or a defense for unethical behaviors. A typical line goes like this: "I was just following orders." So how do we safeguard ethical autonomy in these bureaucratic organizations? Professor Cooper developed this design approach to pursue a more ethical organization and a more ethical administration. His idea is that when thinking about ethical solution, one must take into account the organizational setting. We cannot just stop at analyzing an ethical problem or finding the most ethical course of action. We need to take the entire organizational setting into account, especially the organizational structure and the culture. Changes need to happen at the organizational level in this regard so that we can have a more ethical organization and administration. For managers, this means to join organizational development with ethics. As many of you know, Professor Cooper was deeply influenced by Saul Alinsky and Martin Luther King and followed them in community organizing and the civil rights movement. Right, some nice picture that we saw a moment ago, I guess, from that period. So he always had this deep concern on civic engagement and democratic governance. I think his lifelong work on civic engagement is another important part of his intellectual contributions. While not a major focus of this book, he still dedicated some space to discuss these important topics. For example, he discussed the role of citizenry in democratic governance based on a critique of the dichotomy between politics and administration. He developed an argument for the political nature of the public administrative role and discussed the obligations of public administrators in representing citizens in not just the policy making, but also policy implementation, and also their roles in educating politicians and citizens. So as a junior scholar on a tenure clock, while being pushed to publish as many and as soon as possible, sometimes I ask myself these questions. Right? So what will your lasting intellectual contribution be when you retire? What are the big questions that you help to address? I typically ask myself when I lose sleep. Not all scholars are fortunate or are able to make these lasting intellectual contributions to their scientific community. Professor Cooper certainly did with this book on the analysis of the ethics for the administrative role, and on another book on ethical citizenship. This book will prove to be highly relevant in at least the decades to come. I don't want to make a too bold a prediction that it will be relevant in the next century. But what is the proof, right? You might wonder. So with modernity comes optimism that with the progress in science and technology, we will be able to solve most, if not all, the problems facing our society. We did make remarkable progress in dealing with diseases like HIV or responding to natural disasters like a hurricane. We no longer need to participate in the guessing game of where this hurricane is going to land, in the Florida Keys or in North Carolina, right? But however, science and technology can rarely help us to address our ethical problems. If 4 years ago, somebody told me that nepotism is not only tolerated, but also celebrated at the very top of the federal government, in a country that prided itself as the beacon of democracy, I would have laughed at that person. But unfortunately, this is the reality that we are living in. With all the progress we have made, we are no more ethical than people 100 years ago. And there's no guarantee that people 100 years later will be more ethical than we do. So as Professor Cooper pointed out in this book, as long as we have the differentiation between the role as an administrator and the role as a citizen, there will be ethical problems. And as long as we are dealing with our temptation, there will be ethical violations. So the need for good administrative ethics is more than ever at this point. But the need for an approach to help us understand the sources of ethical problems and to respond ethically to these dilemmas will always be there. And that is exactly where this book did better than any other. So with that, I conclude my discussion. Thank you.
Hello. It is such an honor to have the opportunity to talk with all of you about Professor Terry Cooper's work. Terry is a luminary for those of us on the research side and on the practice side who are grappling with the questions and the challenges of ethical decision-making in the public sphere. And I'm going to pick up on some of the civic engagement themes that Weijie talked about. So at the heart of Terry's conception of ethical decision-making in the public sphere is hearing the needs, hearing the voices of all the people who will be affected by the decision. And doing that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of prioritization on the part of public officials. Like, it is not easy to hear from everybody who will be affected by a decision made in government. It takes getting out there, reaching out, talking with people, and this is especially difficult when there's conflicting needs, conflicting voices that need to be understood, and especially difficult when there are people who are hard to reach, hard for public officials to hear from. So Terry actually recently came to my Fundamentals of Public Administration class a couple weeks ago. A few of my very enterprising students recruited him to be a part of their group presentation. I didn't even know he was coming. And so he encouraged this group of students of mine, this group of future public administrators and nonprofit administrators, to get out from behind their desks, to get out from the desk work, to get out from the paperwork, to carve out time in their schedule, day to day, week to week, to get out there and meet with people in the community, hear from them, go to community meetings, go to neighborhood councils, request meetings with stakeholders, do the work to actually get out there, like even if it means that some of the paperwork will be left undone, because there'll always be enough paperwork to keep you at your desk all the time. But set it aside sometimes and make it a priority to do that. And this is the work of hearing the voices of everyone who will be affected by decisions made in the public sphere. So Terry lights the way for us here. So Terry's work speaks directly to what I see as the key issue today for democracies in the US and around the world, the key challenge, and that's attending to the needs of people who are the least well off. That democracies need to do a better job of this, that we need to do a better job of this in the US. And this is a really difficult thing to do in a way that everyone, on all ends of the income and wealth spectrum, can feel reasonably good about. And it requires, I think, citizen participation, the likes of which Terry guides us on, and it really is a luminary for us, his work is. It requires citizen participation to make the work of government more legitimate and better suited to whatever the goal at hand is. Citizens themselves, who knows where the shoe pinches, need to be involved and are sometimes just as good as pointing to the direction that programs ought to be set up in as our experts are. That part of the work of public administrators is to reach out and create forums for deliberation for citizens to be involved in this work of figuring out how we can especially better meet the needs of the least well off. And Terry, again, is just such a luminary in this regard. One challenge that Terry points out that I think is in his work, that he points out that I think is really important today, and that I think is something that we would all do well to really think about and try to figure out how to do a better job with, and that's how to hear people's needs, even when those needs, as they tell them, are just cloaked in xenophobia or racism or homophobia or sexism, that those needs are still heard, that people don't disengage or turn away or stop listening, that those be treated as problems, but that people's needs, even when they are sort of intermingled with some of those things, still need to be heard. And that's a challenge for us today, and one that I think we can do a better job of. And a problem that Terry has pointed out in his work, and I think one that deserves a lot more attention. The last thing I want to say is Terry really advocates for public decision makers to really try and expand what I think of as expand the size of the pie of just possible options, possible available options that could be taken, possible decisions that could be made. He calls this, that there's this need to avoid ethical tunnel vision, that we need to instead expand the possible options we could take. He writes, until we take the initiative to systematically and aggressively widen the range of conceivable options and assess how they fit both rationally and emotionally with our value system, we're at the mercy of the most obvious course of action. So another gem that Terry offered to my students recently is that they ought to get really comfortable with conflict. That a lot of public officials are just nervous and avoid conflict. And he said, you need to get comfortable with conflict, really comfortable with conflict, and not get angry by it, but also not hide from it or avoid it. That when people's needs conflict, and they often do, people's needs who are going to be affected by any decision made in the public sphere, that ethical decision-making requires those in the public sphere to be ready to deal constructively with conflict, to take it on, head on in a constructive way. So I think a key part of sort of expanding this pie of possible options, of avoiding this ethical tunnel vision in public decision-making, lies in getting better at conflict resolution and negotiation. And again, to do so in a way that everybody involved can approximate or we can attempt to all feel reasonably good about. It's hard work to get to that point. It's where these emotions come in that Terry again and again in his works these are important to the work of public administration. So Terry's is such a luminary for us in this regard as well. So for all of these reasons and so many more, Terry's work will continue to guide our efforts at ethics in public decision-making for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia, and I'm so excited to be here. This has been a really fun process preparing for this. So Terry Cooper is the first person I emailed when I was even considering doing a PhD. And I got the fastest response to an email that I've ever received. And he invited me to come for lunch. And, you know, some of the things that we've heard from my other panelists up here, that there's this notion of ethical autonomy and integrity that's sort of consistent throughout his book. And one of the core concepts in sort of building up those skills within yourself is connecting the rational and the emotional. And I really appreciate the emphasis on not disregarding the emotional experience of navigating ethical decisions. So what I'm going to force you guys to do is go on a little journey with me where I sort of explain to you how Professor Cooper has made me feel over the course of starting this journey of becoming a PhD student. So in our first meeting, we met just down the street at the faculty club. And he managed to make me both so excited and so heartbroken in the same lunch. Mostly by expanding my horizons and thinking about what was possible by potentially pursuing this path in academics, and then telling me that he was going to retire in about 3 years. What was really interesting to me is I have a habit of, in conversation, being most comfortable asking a bunch of questions and listening. And in that first conversation, he really flipped the script on me and forced a lopsided conversation where I ended up ranking the values that were underneath my initial curiosity around a PhD, and essentially pulling me through the model that he articulates in the book in trying to evaluate for myself, is this the right life choice? So there's a growth edge that he's exposing just in the way he goes about interacting with people that he comes across. And he's not telling me what to do. He's not sort of in the way I was used to sort of teachers doing. He wasn't pointing at a right direction and a wrong direction. He was basically creating space for me to identify opportunities for myself. And that's some of the skill building that gets addressed in his book that's really fascinating to sort of unpack. So, you know, quickly after that lunch, I go on Amazon and I buy just about everything, every book Terry Cooper's ever written, including this one, which is great. And it was really refreshing to read it for a second time. Interestingly enough, I think someone on the last panel mentioned that it was fun to like see their old highlights and revisit their previous thinking. I had the pleasure of being a low-budget graduate student and getting a used book, and I got to read the highlights of a practitioner. Which was really fascinating because, you know, I haven't worked in public service, and I'm sitting here and he has all of these beautiful cases. Well, not beautiful, they're all really hard cases. But I get to see a public administrator write comments in the margins like, oh, there's no way I would do it this way, or I can't believe this is the suggestion. And I get to watch myself be in conflict with this public administrator, right? And so even as I'm sitting by myself in my apartment, without knowing it, he's forcing me into a deliberation with a fictional public administrator as I'm going through his book. And, you know, I had in my mind this sort of false choice that sort of there's academic work and there's applied work, and I didn't really see where the intersection was. I sort of was apprehensive about it. I had this background in sort of habit design and skill building and a little bit of a background in athletics and design thinking. And then I opened the pages of this book written by one of, the most well-known academics in the field of civic engagement, which is what I was interested in. And it's so inviting. It's written in such an approachable way. And it just kind of says, come in, the water's warm, like test these concepts out, and here's how it connects to the real world. And it was tangible. It was like very easy for me to see like, oh, he's talking about building a muscle and strengthening a muscle. And over time, you can't read about these things in the abstract or give people a prescription necessarily because each case is going to be different. So what you're actually doing is you're shaping mental models about how do you, in a pressure-filled environment with constrained time, get someone to think in this like expanded pie way, where it's not just an either-or decision, where we're not focused so much on the tunnel vision of choosing between two bad options, but we're actually sitting there and unpacking what are the values in conflicts, what are the principles that underlie those values, and how can I sort of reconcile what's rational and how I feel in my gut about where we should go next. And the really beautiful piece where it gets super ugly and complicated is how do I do that in a group of people that are really different from me, where I have a bunch of constituents or a bunch of people that are my peers from different backgrounds, and I have to figure out how are we going to get to a space that makes sense, where we can move forward on something and all feel okay about it, because it seems like we're in a lose-lose setting. And so, from first email to first meeting to first book I picked up in this PhD progression, then his class is the first class I take, the first fall that I'm here. And what's so cool is that he walks the talk. He's not just sort of sharing what he thinks, but he's interacting in the classroom in a way that gets students to engage in this model before he even presented the model to us. And it's like explicitly and implicitly he lives this process, and he held the space, which I keep saying, but it's so hard to do, especially at a school like USC where we have such a diverse student population. And in that particular class, it was 50% international, 50% domestic, and just it was a really different classroom environment where students weren't all necessarily on the same page. And he forced students to sort of develop and flex this new muscle of thinking creatively about cases in a way that sort of embraced difference and approached problem solving not in a how can I pitch this to the other people in my group so they buy into what I think, but in a really humble, how can I truly take a step back and embrace what everyone who's really different has to say about this particular issue so that we can move forward in a new and sort of invigorated direction. So that really spoke to me on a lot of levels, sort of this commitment to creating an environment for students of all backgrounds where they felt invited to participate. And once you get people understanding that they have a new muscle they can use, the conversation over the course of the semester it takes off exponentially. You see people contributing in ways that are so radically different from the way they were contributing in the beginning of the year. And that's just a testament, again, to his ability to sort of hold the space and create an environment where you don't realize you're learning the core principles until finally at the end of the semester he puts one slide up about the model and you're like, oh my gosh, you've been doing this to us the entire time. Fascinating. So what I was hoping to do today is really just say thank you. You've changed the course of my life personally. Just reading this book for a second time, in the past 2 weeks as I've been brushing up and trying to figure out what to say, I get to know myself better through reading your book. It's like I see the true version of myself because it forces me to, read a couple pages, go out into the world and see that every day public administrators and just people are confronted with ethical decisions. And what you've done for me is you've empowered me with a skill set where now I don't automatically go into that tunnel vision. I have the stop and pause that we talked about in another panel, but to just sit and reflect and take in just a little bit more before I rush to judgment or rush to action. And for me, that's been transformational. And beyond just what you've contributed on paper and in writing, what you've done is you've held the space in all of these classrooms over all of these years, and you've developed this muscle that students of yours might not even realize they have, but they take forward in every decision they make going forward. And that's a beautiful thing, because scholars are going to read your work, for sure. But people in the field, people in practice that now have this sort of new way of approaching difficult situations and difficult conversations, they have a way of impacting the people around them and the communities they serve in a really profound way. And for that, I think we all just want to pause and say thank you. You've helped the USC community grow, you've helped me grow, and you've helped probably countless people who you'll never even realize. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to let our panelists go because we haven't had a chance to have some of the discussions around other panels, and I'm going to wing it right now. Dan, Tridib, and Terry, we just happen to have 3 chairs up here that would be perfect for you. Could you come and join us? Thank you. Unfortunately, Martin was not feeling well, and so he had to go home, and so I'm really sorry about that, but we still have the objects of intention here that we're going to have a discussion with. So one of the things that we were hoping that we could do is have a discussion around some of the issues that you heard that seem to be important, because I think there are a number of them that are cross-cutting with these scholars. And so I'd be curious about whether or not we've got any observations or any questions for them. Thank you very much, David.
What struck me as I was sitting here all during the day is all 4 of you, or 3 of you, have had taken, in some sense, a longer view. That you've built careers not out of a single idea and gone deep, but you've looked in various ways. And I guess I would like to ask your advice of how the Price School, or the students and others, and those around us, could develop that same kind of longer view, both as individuals, as a school, as an institution, and as a society. So think about that for a second. My second one is a little different, and that was, Professor Heiss over there, I thought, brought up a really nice interaction between Martin and Dan. And others, Anastasia, set up a platform for us to see interactions between Tridib and Dan and Terry and Martin. And so I'm curious about how you have viewed, though, how can we ensure that the next generation of scholars, next generation of practitioners, understand ways to look beyond their own tunnel vision and to seek and see the interconnections between those around us?
Well, to make David happy, I'll just remind you, David, that I was a history major too at that other place across town. So that background for me was really formative. So I tend to come to everything from a historical perspective. So if you take the longer view, looking backward as well as looking forward. Is that what you had in mind? Yeah. That's just part of who I am and how I grew up in academia. So you don't see that so much in The Responsible Administrator, but in the other book that has not lasted as long, it's dense and more scholarly, An Ethic of Citizenship for Public Administration. There's a lot of history in that, going back through how our our legal and ethical traditions of citizenship emerged over time from the founding and before. So I guess one thing I would suggest is that I don't think we treat history enough in this program. Everybody wants to have everything included, and we have a limit to the size of the program because the cost and the time to spend would be difficult for many people. But I think we're, not just in this school, but in the field of public administration, public policy, in danger of losing those historic roots. We're being driven back to some of that now by the crisis in the federal government at the very top, having to look back, and people are now reminding us what the founders had in mind. They're quoting from the Federalist Papers. That's important, I think, to know who we are by knowing where we came from and on whose shoulders we stand.
As I was listening to Terry, I have to say, me too. I think increasingly see myself as a historian. I've been some of my recent, maybe it's the influence of David and earlier Greg, his colleagues. But I just finished a book which took me, I think, the last 20 years, about the city design in developing the global South. And I found that we wanted to sort of come up with some prospective view about, what could happen in the future. But I found that it's very difficult to kind of get a fix on the global change, the globalization, and the way the nations and cities are changing in such a rapid way. It's very difficult to talk about not only just the future, but even the present is constantly shifting. But what is fixed, however, is the history. So that's where we are both in empirical work and analysis. You can only kind of draw with some degree of confidence from what's there, right? So. But I think so, but it's inevitable then that, if you want to talk about the future, take a longer range view, you must have a good sense of the history of what happened previously. And so I totally agree with Terry's point on that. And I didn't consciously see it this way until we asked this question. But I think that I'm becoming increasingly aware of that position.
That's interesting, David, you raised that question, and it's an intriguing one because you asked in the context of what we have to share in terms of the current education. And because, I was a minor in history also, and in fact, all my leisure reading, if you can call it that, is all about history. I'm reading Massey's Catherine the Great right now. Why? Because I bought it one day, and I had a slow moment one day, and I've started it. But so that's just me. But I think the broader question is, how does that become part of the educational experience? How do you get people to think forward? Part of the answer is, by the way, you have to know your past to imagine a future. But knowing your past often stultify people, so that's not enough. And I hate to say it, but I think it has to do with our personalities, which isn't about our education or our degrees. It comes from a curiosity about where we're going. And that curiosity, Dan mentioned a little bit, Daniel Press, a little bit about, my thought of education was to ask questions of students and where they were going and where what they were looking at is going. So unless you give your students the ability to find their path by looking back and thinking forward, that you won't do it. Because otherwise, we know too many of our graduate students, not all, are busy doing the work right now about information we have right now or data we have right now, if you will, the nuts and bolts of getting through. And I don't know how to, that's not wrong, but I don't know how to say, well, then how can you project that forward? And that does give me some pause about what I see today about big data analysis. Unless you can use it for simulating futures, scenarios, I don't think it will get you to think about that future. It gives you great information on understanding what's transpired. So you have to take it You know, and of course, you're looking at me like, yeah, but Dan, you're worried about sustainability and the existential threat of climate change and things that are into the future. But I don't think it's just what I'm looking at. I think in any area, you need to be able to imagine the future before you're going to study it and dedicate your life to it. And not know the answer, but be curious about that future and hopefully come to a value position and a substantive path of knowledge that allows you to then make that a career. Because it's a career. And by the way, being a university, that actually provides us the wonderful opportunity as people to explore questions where everyone else is so busy doing things. And I, you know, that's been the luxury, the benefit, the value of being 50 years in this profession.
So if I remember the second question correctly.
Could I just add one more comment to the first question?
Sure, go ahead.
Does anybody know the book Thinking in Time? It came out maybe 30 years ago. Yeah, how many people? You know that book?
I think so.
Yeah, it was a marvelous work on how to think historically about current situations. Just to try to see the historical antecedents and roots.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may have some clues about how to teach. I found it really engaging.
Yeah.
About how to teach it, how to work history into our teaching. So.
Good. Thanks, Terry. So if I recall the second question, it's really how we can institutionalize some of the connections that people have drawn around some of the panels that we've had today that are just exemplary. They show how we could possibly see those connections.
I'll take a lead on that because I was sitting in the back saying, so why didn't we have these conversations before today? Mm-hmm. I mean that sincerely. Because no matter how much I would like to think I've been exploring many things and everybody else is, we haven't sat down and talked about public space. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking the whole time we're learning about public space, I'm thinking, well, you know, wasn't that a place for political discourse? I mean, I have some vague recollection about that. And is that now being replaced by social media? And is it the same, and I don't know the answer, but is it the same kind of obligation and responsibility to one another that you can ultimately feel in a visceral way in a physical public space that may or may not be possible in an electronic space? I don't have an answer. I'm willing to admit I'm too old to appreciate the new, but I think it's really quite profound. And we never talked about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, why not? Well, because you didn't come to me and tell me what you were doing. So we're learning today. So how can you ask assistant professors who are so busy with what they need to do to have this kind of intellectual dialogue without knowing where it's going? Mm-hmm. So it's a challenge, but maybe it's more sessions like this. And I don't mean retirement sessions. I don't mean cluster retirements. I mean conversations cultivated by the school and its various parts that are about serious questions and ask ourselves these questions.
I can think of one experience that really stands out during my time in the school with Peter, the economist, planner? Peter Gordon. When Peter had published a book and somebody in the school said, let's have Peter present the book and let's have you debate him. Because they've heard me sometimes criticizing economists. and Peter and I met, talked through some things, but then we did that over in our auditorium. And I don't know whether anybody else enjoyed it, but I really did because he and I were able to see things that were different, but things that were very similar in his work in planning and economics and my work in ethics and civic engagement. It was a wonderful experience.
Maybe that's you need to precipitate a conversation as someone's written an article or book and you say, well, let's talk about it. It's not so simple, but basically things like that as scholars and academics we can relate to discussing a book.
Yep, absolutely.
And the Banerjee Center does it, but not at this level.
So the answer is that we need to find some common themes that bring people from different parts of the Price School together. I think, the public space and the political theory, there are political theories who have been talking about public space and associate public space with the First Amendment rights. I mean, Margaret Cohn says that's the most fundamental thing. And now there are discussion that there are some Fourth Amendment rights about the surveillance issues that are becoming increasingly common as we are having all kinds of closed-circuit television and cameras all over the place. Argument is that we should consider that the Supreme Court rule that you leave your Fourth Amendment rights when you cross the threshold of your home, and when you're out public, you are, you don't have either Fourth Amendment rights. But some legal scholars are arguing, no, we have to treat that we carry our Fourth Amendment rights upon ourselves. So even when you're in a public space, we are entitled to our privacy. And this is, I think, Anastasia and we did a paper on that. So we drew from political theory, we drew from legal discussion scholars, and even this notion of Yoshino, who's a professor of law at Yale, wrote a book about covering, which is really about sexual identity and that sort of stuff. But you can also imagine that a public space that might change if you are subject to surveillance. So this gets into a little bit of the future thinking too, that what would happen if we are constantly surveilled by cameras. This legal theorists argue that it's nobody's business if I'm going to see a marriage counselor or a fertility clinic or even a yoga place. The government or anybody doesn't have right to have that information. So that's part of your individual rights. And if those are taken away, the people might behave differently. I mean, there might be a culture of covering yourself. Men might be wearing false beard and mustache. Women might be wearing more broad-rimmed hats or carrying parasols. And we might find the different ways of dodging these cameras that everywhere in the public space. So this is a little bit of kind of you project into the future what you might be seeing, but it requires exchange, discussion, reading literature from other fields. And that's what the universities are for, right?
If I may, this also becomes cultural habit. Mm-hmm. When I mentioned at their school, it's our university, but all universities, this is when I say cultural habit, the habit of getting together and having a dialogue. Well. There's a one-off. I heard the one-off, and the trouble is you remembered it once from your experience. And, I'm not any different in remembering, but I don't know that it's been embedded in the DNA of what we are doing.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And the interesting thing about the Price School, it brings together enough differences around similar themes, but very different perspectives. And we have the capacity to actually have a pretty good dialogue just within Price, not to mention the whole university.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I took from the day, one of the little bits of magic were our panels.
Yes.
Because what we asked them to do was to put your work in context.
I'm impressed what they said I did.
Yeah. They did a phenomenal.
Had no idea.
They did a phenomenal job around this. Absolutely.
They make us look good.
But I think this is also a lesson in terms of the dialogue, because what tends to happen, especially within a research-oriented university, is we come at our research with a particular set. Somebody was talking about shorthand. We have particular things, streams that we go into without thinking about that, sometimes that broader perspective. Having someone else identify that engages at a different level. And I thought that was really
so my wife tells me I look all the time, but I don't really see much. and she's talking about our family life. And she's probably right. I mean, I say I didn't see that, but I looked at it, but I didn't see that. Mm-hmm. And that's very real, though. That was a very telling comment about what we don't see, even if we look right at it.
Yep, great. How about some other observations or some other questions?
I might mention that, speaking of Peter Gordon and Harry Richardson, I remember we had an exchange in Japa about, they wrote an article called Market Planning, Oxymoron or Common Sense. And so basically taking the position, best planning is no planning, the market process kind of take over. That's the most efficient outcome. And so when the editor asked me to write a counterpoint to that, which I called Market Planning, Market Planners, and Planned Markets, kind of take off on Jack Dykeman's earlier article, Social Planning, Social Planners, and Planned Societies. And so I remember Harry saying, "Why are we hanging our dirty laundry out in the public?" But we could have had that kind of a debate internally, and I think maybe we should, your discussion with Peter Gordon, that could be a part of it, kind of a panel or at least a conversation. So one possibility might be, we have lots of individual talks from lectures and all that, but we may want to think about doing a kind of an ongoing kind of a panels discussion where we get our faculty from private schools to pick up some whether it's sustainability or public space or issues about fire in the Hollywood Hill or hills of Los Angeles, and we could that might actually serve I think answer some of David's questions.
Yeah, sounds good. We have Juliet.
It struck me. Oh, thanks. One thing that struck me hearing people speak was being able to have a glimpse into everyone's classrooms, which I really appreciated, because I don't think we spend, and now I'm actually wearing the academic affairs hat, apparently, where we stand is where we sit. But it struck me that we don't really get to see into each other's classrooms very much, and so I really enjoyed being able to hear students talk about, classroom practices and kind of mentoring relationships, because that's kind of some of the invisible work, at least to our colleagues, even though it's a big part of the work that we do. And so, I think as we move forward with this Committee on Excellence in Teaching and start thinking about how we embed that more into the culture of the school, I would really like to think about having maybe these kinds of discussions just not about cross-cutting ideas, but about cross-cutting classroom practices as well, which is kind of the point about how you both look and see. And I loved that example of that exercise, and we just don't share teaching practice enough at the school. So I'm hoping that we can do that moving forward. It's just a comment, I guess, more than a question.
Yes, Jack.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank all of the panelists. You did an amazing job. It was really engaging. I've particularly enjoyed it because I don't get to do this very often. I usually come in and give a welcome and have to leave. And so it was really pleasurable to hear all the comments and intellectual vigor that described what these wonderful scholars have done. I also, and Mike and I were talking about this, we think we ought to do this on an annual basis, not the retirement part, but, as a school, have at a minimum, have a day like this in which we bring together themes across the school and have panels that focus on them. So we're looking for, at a minimum, we should do that. We should think of other ways to do it as well. My question is, about, it struck me that in each case, the panelists talked about the intellectual contribution, but they also talked about each of you as people and how you as people influenced them in the classroom, outside the classroom, in the coffee shop or wherever. And I'd like you to say something about how you feel about that. Do you feel a connection between who you are as a person and who you are intellectually, and how important that might be or not be in your role as an academic?
Shall I begin? I think a lot of that comes from my own mentors. And the way I was treated by my mentors was part of my however I deal with the students, was very much drawn from my mentors, both my time at the University of Washington, the master's students. Mike Wolf was the chair, and became very sort of a close, almost like a father figure. And then later, when I went to MIT, Kevin Lynch was my mentor. And that's the way, I learned from there the way they dealt with students. It's not that they're necessarily very soft, pushover type guys. They had pretty strong views, and with Lynch, for example, the thing was that once our challenge was how not to take a position, because once he takes a position, it's very hard to sort of get involved in the position. So keep the discussion going and open. But it's very hard to sort of summarize everything that I have obtained from him, and so I attribute it to my mentors of what I really represent.
I'd second that. It's hard not to look back at your own experience and say, well, but I did that in graduate school. And it was actually oftentimes the best part of that experience, not just with my professors, but my fellow graduate students. Those were exciting times and conversations, and sometimes those with the graduate students were more exciting because they didn't really care who I was. They told me what they thought. We didn't exactly do that with the professor, but still, it's part of that learning about learning and the excitement about it. And I may be a little different than the other two, is I frankly have been a little more selective, I think, in the sense the students have to come to me with things I think I can help them with. And my influence has been the environment and governance and so forth. So if you came to me in another field or another question, I probably wouldn't be as inviting and as willing to give the time to mentor them. Because I really do, I haven't tried to deny it, I have really significant social objectives that I hope are realized in our society. So I'm limited in terms of my ability to really help, except for the areas that I know. But the process isn't any different. And it is what I learned or practiced in graduate. It may be deeper than that. I don't remember what happened before graduate school. It was so long ago, and in my early life. But so there's part of it's personality, I'm sure, but part of it's our socialization as part of the academic community. And it's, I think, a little harder today to carry on that kind of rapport than when I was in school. Because we're busier, we're larger, the world's moving faster, there's more expectations of us. Still, that's how we learned.
I think for me, it was two things. One, my first teaching experiences were in an experimental urban studies program here at USC, the urban semester. So we had typically 40 students who were with us for their entire 16 units in a given semester. We were in the classroom, we were out in the community. On the day that LAPD and the Black Panthers had a shootout not far from here, I had students in black and white cars all around that scene. We didn't have cell phones. I knew that was happening, but I couldn't get to those students. They came back and told us they were on the floors of the black and white cars. Having Henry Mancini and Frank Zappa into the classroom to talk about music in the city and seeing Frank Zappa jump up on a piano and start dancing in the middle of all this, we lived with those students. And when you live with students like that, you cannot sort of compartmentalize yourself. They see you in your good times and your not so good times. And so they have a chance to see you as somewhat of a whole person. In that program, I began to feel comfortable with that after being a Methodist minister for 10 years. Very different experience. The other thing was, does anybody in the room remember Lou Wechsler? Oh, yeah, you do. So Lou was an associate dean here in the old School of Public Administration. He had been with us in the old Center for Urban Affairs before that merged with the School of Public Administration. And Lou, I lived in Rancho Palos Verdes. Lou lived in Palos Verdes Estates, so we carpooled into campus every day and home, or the days we both traveled in. And, you know, I wasn't conscious of what was going on, but Lou was mentoring me through those trips to the campus and back home at night. He would be asking me questions about, you know, and we were just having a conversation, right? Well, it was more than that. About what was going on in my classroom and problems I was facing. And he's the first one. I mean, I came in with no knowledge of what academe was really like. I'd been a community organizer for the Methodist Church in East Harlem and Pico Union, and I didn't know about what tenure was about. And at some point, Lou took me aside and he says, son, you know, you know about this thing called tenure? And I said, well, I've heard of it. What is it? And Lou began to explain to me, well, you've just got a few more years to make it. And, oh boy, you know, that was a splash of cold water in the face. And if you don't, you know, you're going to be looking for a job with a cloud over your head. So Lou Wechsler really helped me to understand how to be with students, how to try to open yourself to students. And so when I begin a class, every class I begin, I tell students there are two principles I try to balance in a classroom. One is openness and the other is privacy. Those two things are in tension. And what that means to me is that you can ask me any question you want to ask about me, my background, who I am, what I do, where I've been. I reserve the right to say I'd rather not talk about that particular thing. And I want you to have the same rights. I want you to feel free to ask any question in a classroom, and if it involves somebody in the classroom, they should feel free to say, oh yeah, I'll talk about that, but I'll only talk about this part of it. So you try to balance it. And in that way, students start becoming more open to each other and more understanding of their relationships.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and finish this up at this stage of the game. That was the heavy question anyway for us to all have to think about, how we relate as individuals around what it is that we do. And I think that's really key. Stay here for just a second. This won't be painful, I promise. So one of the things that I wanted to do was, again, thank the panelists for all that they did. They really did a phenomenal job. And as I was sitting reflecting on this, they provided such insight into the work that was done. They provided a context for that insight as well. So we understood how each of their works fit within this broader field, whether it was our field or not. The other thing is that they did such a phenomenal job of demonstrating the ability of our colleagues to be able to predict what was coming out. The prescience came through very nicely. And they also were able to talk about it within the context of those perspectives that they had that are going to be enduring. You can't ask more of a panel than something like that. So we were really impressive. Let me make some closing remarks, and these are really quick. I've had the great pleasure in my previous job as Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs of reading a lot of work from our assistant professors and our associate professors for obvious reasons. They're going up for a promotion. I'm reading the body of their work. It was a great education for me. And it really gave me insight into both the fields and the individuals and what they wanted to be able to do. We don't do that with our senior faculty. And it's not because we want to give the senior faculty a pass. It's just that we don't necessarily have that kind of effort to be able to integrate some of those thoughts. We've seen today what could happen if we actually did that. And I think we've got some opportunities as we move forward to try to make this not just a one-time deal, but something that is continuing, that helps us think more about what we are as the Price School. You know, the other thing that I look at as I read through the material from my four friends, colleagues, and scholars, is that while the disciplines and fields in which they labored are different than mine, I got some really interesting lessons out of this about where we do have similarities and how we have overlapping areas. They've challenged us to reconsider how we envision and establish values as well as meaning, which are both really key concepts for us to be able to think about within a public context. The other piece that cuts across all of their work is this issue around social equity. virtually every one of our colleagues, all the way through the work that they had done, had elements associated with social equity. That is a really remarkable statement, and one that we really need to embrace within the Price School. The other thing that was fascinating to me is that, and I want you to think about this definition, they really were practicing and advocating mindfulness before it was a popular notion. So a lot of times we're thinking about mindfulness within the context of a particular individual experience. They were practicing the real element of mindfulness, which is to be able to creatively understand what's going on within your present day, and to be able to apply it. They were doing that within a much broader social context. So in recent discussions that I've had with each of them, they've individually expressed some of the new areas that they find engaging and important. I think these are really exciting and meaningful. I know that each of them will continue to be a part of the Trojan family as they continue their scholarship. There's a reason that one of the university's important documents indicates that all faculty requirement is considered early. And that is the recognition that our best thinkers don't stop reflecting when they change the level of their investment with the institution. It's clear to me that Tridib, Dan, Martin, and Terry are going to continue their commitment to our communities so that they might make them better. I know you'll join me in thanking them for their past and continued contributions to our well-being. Can we give a round of applause to our honorees?